Everyone knows the story of David and Goliath, the ultimate tale of faith against impossible odds. But what most people don't know is that the story didn't end when the giant fell. Goliath was not an only child. He had 4 brothers, other giants who watched from the shadows and swore a silent, blood-soaked oath of vengeance. This is the hidden history of a war that nearly cost King David his life and threatened to extinguish the light of Israel forever. Before we delve into this forgotten war, if you appreciate stories that uncover the hidden depths of Scripture, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss a chapter. Let us know in the comments if you've ever heard this part of the story before. Now, let us return to the Valley of Elah. In the moments after the stone was thrown, the sound that finally broke the 40-day siege of fear was not a mere cheer, it was a physical tearing of the sky. It was a raw, primal scream of catharsis that erupted from the throats of thousands of men who had forgotten what hope felt like. The sound wave rolled across the dusty floor of the Valley of Elah, a tangible force that seemed to scour the very stones clean of the despair that had settled upon them like a shroud. For the soldiers of Israel, who had spent an eternity cowering in their trenches, their courage whittled down to nothing by the daily corrosive taunts of a single monstrous man, this sound was the breaking of a powerful curse. The air itself, once thick and suffocating with the metallic tang of dread, suddenly became thin and sharp, tasting of an intoxicating, unbelievable freedom. Yet high above this volcanic eruption of joy, perched on a barren, windswept ridge that loomed over the valley like a frowning deity, 4 colossal figures stood as immobile as the mountains themselves. For them, the jubilant noise was not a celebration, it was a blasphemy. It was a high-pitched, grating frequency of violation that scraped against their very souls. It was the sound of insects rejoicing, a funeral dirge for their entire world, played on the triumphant horns of lesser beings. Their eyes, like chips of obsidian, were fixed on the scene below. They watched as a boy, a ridiculously, insultingly small creature, stood over the immense fallen form of their brother Goliath. They watched the sickening, awkward heave as the boy struggled to lift their brother's own greatsword. They watched the flash of sunlight on the massive blade, a blade forged to slaughter armies, as it was brought down with shocking brutality upon the thick column of Goliath's neck. The sight was not simply a death, it was a desecration of the highest order, a defilement of the sacred hierarchy of might and terror upon which their entire existence was founded. These were the last of their kind, the 4 remaining sons of the great giant of Gath, a lineage whispered to be touched by the shadow of the fallen divine. There was Ishbi-Benob, the eldest, his weathered face a mask of granite, his heart a cold, dark forge where a silent, terrible fury was being hammered into a blade of pure vengeance. As the firstborn, the shame struck him with the force of a physical blow, a weight of responsibility settling upon his massive shoulders. Beside him stood Saf, a veritable mountain of muscle and sinew, whose immense frame seemed to vibrate with a barely contained destructive energy. A low, guttural growl rumbled in his chest, a sound like stones grinding together deep within the earth. He was power personified, and the sight of their brother's defeat was a direct, personal assault on his very nature. Then there was Lami, so eerily similar to Goliath in stature and bearing that he appeared as a ghostly living echo of the champion who now lay headless in the dust. In Goliath's fall, Lami saw his own reflection shattered, his own destiny stolen and mocked. A part of his own soul felt as if it had been severed along with his brother's head. And finally, there was the other, a towering enigma whose name was rarely spoken, a warrior whose physical form bore the unsettling marks of their tainted bloodline in stranger, more profound ways. While the others seethed with a visible fire, he was utterly still, his silence radiating a cold, alien malevolence that was, perhaps, the most terrifying of all. Together, in that shared, horrific moment, they felt an emotion so foreign, so utterly alien to their experience, that it took their breath away. It was fear. Not the craven, panicked terror they were accustomed to inspiring in the scurrying creatures below, but a deep, hollowing, existential dread for what this moment signified. Their bloodline, the Rephaim, the diluted but still potent echoes of the antediluvian Nephilim, had been bred for a single purpose: dominion. The ancient whispers in their blood spoke of a world that was rightfully theirs, a world where their kind walked as gods among mortals. Their towering forms were the ultimate argument, their strength an undeniable truth. And now, a shepherd boy, with no armor but his conviction, no weapon but a pebble and a strip of leather, had unwritten their entire history. He had proven their divine truth to be a mortal lie. As the Israelites, emboldened by the impossible sight, began to swarm from their positions, their victory cries growing from a roar into a deafening avalanche of sound, the pride of Gath was not merely wounded, it was eviscerated. The humiliation was a white-hot spiritual poison searing through their veins, burning away every lesser emotion, every thought, every impulse, until only one thing remained, the need for retribution. In that instant, a silent, unbreakable covenant was forged between them. No words were exchanged, none were needed. Their shared gaze, burning with a cold black fire across the distance, was a vow more binding than any oath sworn upon a blood-soaked altar. This shepherd boy, this David, had not ended a war. He had, with his single, smooth stone, declared a new one. A personal, spiritual war that would not end until his light was brutally and permanently extinguished from the earth. To comprehend the cold, implacable fury that was forged in the hearts of Goliath's brothers, one must journey back beyond the age of kings and judges, back beyond the Exodus and the patriarchs, to a dark and shadowed chapter in the earth's primordial history. Before a single giant rose to cast his terrifying shadow over the armies of Israel, before the name Goliath was ever whispered in fear across the valleys of Philistia, there existed a secret, ancient lineage operating in the margins of creation. This was not a bloodline born merely of flesh and bone, but one conceived in the crucible of a forbidden cosmic union, a grotesque mingling of the celestial and the terrestrial. The roots of this conflict did not begin in the dust of Elah, but in the corrupted soil of the world before the Great Flood. The world then was young, a vibrant, untamed wilderness teeming with a raw, creative energy. Yet beneath this veneer of burgeoning life, it was teetering on the precipice of an unimaginable moral collapse. The sacred texts speak of this time with a chilling, almost breathless brevity, hinting at a corruption so pervasive, so absolute, that it grieved the Creator to his very heart, forcing him to regret the world he had made. At the epicenter of this decay lies a pivotal and deeply mysterious event, recorded in Genesis chapter 6. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown. This single enigmatic verse is a dark portal into one of the most profound and unsettling mysteries of the biblical narrative. Who were these sons of God? And what monstrous thing was born from their illicit union? For centuries, ancient Jewish scholars and the inspired writers of the intertestamental period pored over these texts, and they arrived at a near unanimous and terrifying conclusion. The sons of God were not men of noble birth or pious character. They were celestial beings, angelic watchers, entities of light who had been entrusted with a sacred vigil over the fledgling human race. But captivated by the ephemeral beauty of mortal women, they became ensnared by lust. They abandoned their heavenly station, their designated purpose, and transgressed a divine cosmic boundary that was never meant to be crossed. The Epistle of Jude reinforces this stark interpretation, stating that the angels who did not keep their positions of authority but abandoned their proper dwelling, these he has kept in darkness, bound with everlasting chains for judgment on the great day. Their fall from grace was not a simple act of disobedience, it was a calculated act of cosmic sabotage. They descended to earth not just to indulge their passions, but to deliberately corrupt God's masterpiece from within. They became twisted tutors to humanity, sharing forbidden knowledge that the young race was not ready for. The brutal arts of warfare, the secrets of metallurgy for forging swords and spears, the beguiling crafts of cosmetics and enchantments to sow vanity and deceit, and the dark, seductive whispers of spiritual manipulation and sorcery. And from their unholy union with human women, a new race was born, the Nephilim. The name itself, from the Hebrew root naphal, means to fall, and they were indeed the fallen ones, or more accurately, those who cause others to fall. These hybrid beings were not just physically immense, they were spiritually monstrous. They carried within them a volatile, unstable fusion of celestial power and mortal depravity, a combination that resulted in an aggressive, tyrannical, and insatiably violent nature. They were beings born with a gaping spiritual emptiness, a hollowness they sought to fill with endless conquest, dominion and destruction. They became the heroes of old, men of renown, not for their virtue or noble deeds, but for their terrifying might and their capacity for cruelty. They carved out kingdoms built on fear and bloodshed, their very presence poisoning the earth and accelerating humanity's downward spiral. It is for this reason that the Genesis narrative immediately declares, with a tone of utter finality, "The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time." The Nephilim were the living catalysts for this complete societal collapse, the physical embodiment of a world that had become irretrievably lost in chaos. The Great Flood, therefore, was not an act of arbitrary divine rage, but a desperate, agonizing, surgical act of cleansing. It was a divine reset button, a terrible necessity to wash the earth clean of this pervasive genetic and spiritual contamination. Yet a haunting question has echoed through the millennia. If the flood destroyed all flesh that walked the earth, how did the giants reappear? The answer, though veiled in mystery, is subtly woven into the fabric of the scriptures themselves. Centuries after the waters of the deluge receded, when Moses dispatched 12 spies to scout the promised land, they returned with a report that shattered the morale of an entire nation. In the book of Numbers, they stammer in terror. "We saw the Nephilim there. The descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them." This shocking testimony is the proof. The accursed seed of the giants was not entirely eradicated. How it survived is a matter of intense debate. Some ancient traditions suggest the corrupted DNA was carried across the threshold of the flood, dormant and hidden within the wives of Noah's sons. Others point to the chilling possibility of a second, smaller-scale incursion of fallen angels after the deluge, a renewed and more targeted attempt to pollute the human bloodline and disrupt God's unfolding plan. Whatever the mechanism, this post-diluvian lineage of giants, known by a host of fearful names like the Rephaim, the Anakim, the Zuzim, and the Emim, established themselves in strategic regions throughout Canaan. They haunted the fertile plains of Bashan, they fortified the high hills of Hebron, and most notably they found a permanent, welcoming sanctuary in the powerful Philistine cities, chief among them being Gath. It is precisely into this dark, unbroken legacy that Goliath and his 4 brothers were born. They were not isolated freaks of nature or random genetic anomalies. They were the proud inheritors of a somber and malevolent heritage, the living fruit of a spiritual poison that stubbornly refused to die. Their immense stature was merely the outward sign of the inner spiritual corruption that fueled their rage and defined their purpose. They were the living symbols of a primordial spiritual resistance to the people of God, a rebellion that had now found its ultimate champions. If the cursed blood of the giants was the venom that flowed through the veins of this ancient war, then the city of Gath was the iron chalice that held it, revered it, and offered it to the world. If their corrupt lineage was the twisted seed, then Gath was the dark, blood-fertilized soil where that seed was deliberately nurtured, cultivated, and brought to its most terrifying and defiant bloom. Goliath and his 4 brothers did not simply carry the strength of a malignant heritage within their monstrous frames. They were the ultimate products of a place, a culture, and a spiritual fortress that had stood as a blasphemous monument of defiance against the armies of God for generations. Gath was not just one of the 5 chief Philistine city-states. It was a consecrated sanctuary for monsters, a stronghold built upon the bedrock of ancient forbidden memories, a place where the towering presence of the Rephaim was not just tolerated, but venerated and worshipped. The fact that the Bible meticulously records the birth of Goliath and his kin within the sun-scorched walls of Gath is a critical detail. It signals that this was no ordinary city, but a spiritual redoubt of rebellion, a gate of darkness standing in staunch opposition to the unfolding purpose of Israel and its God. The name Gath, in the ancient Hebrew tongue, is often linked to the word for a winepress, a place of intense pressure and violent crushing. But in the rich symbolic language of the scriptures, its very sound evokes something far more profound, more prophetic. A gate, a portal, a threshold. And in the biblical narrative, anything established as a gate represents more than a physical entryway. It is a point of spiritual access, a zone of critical decision, a liminal space between realms. In the book of Genesis, after his celestial vision of a ladder reaching to the heavens, a terrified and awestruck Jacob declares, "This is none other than the house of God. This is the gate of heaven." It is a foundational spiritual principle. If there exists a gate to the heavens, then it stands to reason that there are also gates of the earth, portals of darkness erected in defiance, spiritual strongholds designed to block, hinder, and wage war against the advance of the divine kingdom. Gath was precisely such a gate. It was a terrestrial nexus point, a place on the earth where the spiritual presence and influence of the ancient Rephaim remained chillingly active and potent. While other regions of Canaan had been systematically conquered and cleansed by the advancing, divinely mandated armies of Israel under Joshua, Gath stood as a defiant, unconquered bastion, a pocket of primordial power that refused to be extinguished. When Joshua led Israel into the Promised Land, his campaign was one of holy war, a systematic uprooting of the spiritual cancers that plagued the land. The book of Joshua, in its historical accounting, highlights a deeply unsettling fact. No Anakites were left in Israelite territory. Only in Gaza, Gath and Ashdod did any survive. This was no mere accident of war, no simple military oversight. It was a stark spiritual reality. While the giant clans were driven from the hills of Hebron and the plains of Bashan, their power broken across the land, in Gath they found a welcoming refuge and remained defiantly untouched. This city became a living museum of a bygone, terrible era. A place where the old ways, the old dark gods, and the old corrupted blood held absolute sway. Gath represented a gateway where the dominion of the giants stubbornly resisted the incoming tide of God's promise. It was the last, unyielding fortress of a culture that venerated brute force above all else, that bowed to idols of stone and wood, and that worshipped the pagan deities, Dagon, Baal, and Ashtoreth, who were believed to be the patrons and supernatural fathers of the sons of Anak. The Philistines of Gath did not merely shelter these giants. They integrated them, celebrated them, and built their military identity around them. They wove them into the very fabric of their society. They sang epic songs of their monstrous deeds, they carved their likenesses into their temples, and they elevated them as living symbols of their people's invincibility. In the sprawling, dusty courtyards and armories of Gath, a young giant was not an outcast or a freak. He was a prince of the city. He was trained in exclusive, heavily guarded barracks, fed the choicest portions of meat and wine, and armed by the city's finest smiths who specialized in crafting weapons of inhuman scale. He was groomed from birth, not just to be a soldier, but to be an icon, a living demigod, a weapon of psychological terror. And it is from this very city, this crucible of anti-God sentiment and giant worship, that Goliath emerged as the ultimate terrifying expression of this dark heritage. His towering height, his impenetrable bronze armor, his unshakable, arrogant confidence, everything about him carried the spiritual weight and backing of the city that had molded him. He did not see himself as a mere warrior champion. In his own mind and in the minds of his people, he was the guardian of the gate. He was a sentinel, raised for the sole sacred purpose of standing in the valley and halting the inexorable advance of God's chosen people and their divine promise. His 40 days of taunts were not just the boasts of an arrogant soldier. They were the official, booming proclamation from the gate of Gath itself. It was a declaration that the power it represented was absolute, and that Israel's God was impotent before it. This powerful symbolism reveals the true, staggering depth of the vengeance that followed his spectacular fall. When David defeated Goliath, he did far more than kill a champion. He symbolically breached the unbreachable gate, he silenced its roaring mouth and brought its pride crashing down into the dust. The defeat of Goliath was a direct, devastating spiritual blow to the very heart of Gath, to the arrogant soul of the city, and to the entire spiritual structure that sustained the giant's godlike presence. The shockwave of that single faith-propelled stone reverberated through every street, every home, and every pagan temple within its high walls. The gate had been violated, and a terrible, vengeful spirit was now unleashed. The scent of Goliath's blood, a coppery tang of disgrace on the evening air, had barely begun to soak into the thirsty soil of the valley when a tremor, deep, violent, and spiritual, shook the foundations of Gath. The giant who had crumpled under the force of a shepherd's stone was far more than a soldier. He was their creed made flesh, their living symbol of supremacy, the roaring epitome of Philistine might, and the proudest heir to the ancient Rephaim legacy. He was a walking, breathing monument to an age when the footsteps of giants were the drumbeat of terror and dominion over the world of men. His fall, therefore, was not a mere casualty of war. It was a cataclysm. It was a profound public desecration of their most sacred icon, a spiritual violation that screamed for a retribution of equal or greater magnitude. For those who shared his ancient, corrupted blood, this was a stain so deep and so dark that only a river of retaliatory blood could ever hope to wash it away. Goliath's brothers were alive. And more significantly, they had been present, silent, hulking silhouettes on a distant ridge, their eyes burning like hot coals as they bore witness to his unbelievable demise. The sacred scriptures, often economical with their details, do not chronicle the mundane aspects of their lives before this earth-shattering moment. Instead, they are thrust into the narrative with a sharp, chilling purpose immediately afterward, their existence given meaning only by the death of their kin. They do not materialize from a historical vacuum. They are presented as the direct, inevitable continuation of the spiritual war that had just been declared in the Valley of Elah. The historical record in the second book of Samuel is stark and clear. 4 more giants, all explicitly born to the giant in Gath, would rise from the ashes of their brother's shame to confront David and his servants. Each of these 4 beings, distinct in his own monstrous form and method of attack, represents a different, terrible facet of the same singular ancestral desire: to avenge the dishonor of Goliath and to rebuild the shattered temple of their lineage's pride with the bones of their enemies. The first to answer this silent, bloody call, the first to rise from the brooding shadows of Gath, was a name that time has almost managed to erase, yet one that carries a deep and menacing weight. Ishbi-Benob. The text paints a picture of him not as a mindless brute, but as a cunning, seasoned warrior, a patient predator who understood the art of the kill. The bronze head of his spear alone was a marvel of brutalist craftsmanship, weighing over 300 shekels, a staggering 13 pounds of sharpened, aerodynamic death. And the text notes a critical detail: he wielded a new sword. This was not his old, battle-worn blade. This was a weapon freshly forged, its edge gleaming with a malevolent light, its purpose singular and sacred in his mind: to find the heart of the King of Israel and silence it forever. Ishbi-Benob was not a soldier fighting for a cause or a country. He was the chosen executor of a blood oath, the avenging arm that the wounded, screaming soul of Gath had been desperate to unleash upon the world. But he was only the first wave. The others watched and waited in the wings, their hatred a slow-burning black fire that would only grow hotter with time. There was Saph, also known as Sippai, another fearsome scion of the giant kin, a being whose very name seemed to crackle with the promise of violence and crushing power. He was an engine of pure, unadulterated destruction, waiting for his moment. Another of David's legendary mighty men, Elhanan of Bethlehem, would later be fated to face a terrifying warrior, explicitly identified in the Chronicles as Lami, the brother of Goliath. The text notes, with a sense of awe, that the shaft of Lami's spear was like a weaver's beam, a weapon so massive and imposing that it was a clear and deliberate echo of the one his fallen sibling had once used to paralyze the armies of Israel with fear. He was a living mirror of their family's shame, a walking embodiment of their need to reclaim their lost honor. And perhaps the most visually unsettling of all was a nameless warrior of breathtaking stature who bore a grotesque physical anomaly, a clear and undeniable mark of their corrupted bloodline: 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot. This 24-digited giant was a walking perversion of the natural order, and he too would step onto the field of battle to roar his defiance at Israel, his heart consumed by the same familial, burning rage. 4 men, 4 shadows of a fallen past, 4 living instruments of a singular, all-consuming hatred. What bound them together was not merely their shared parentage or their common home in the dark heart of Gath. It was their divine, unholy purpose. They would rise at different times, in different battles, under different circumstances, but their focus remained chillingly, terrifyingly consistent. They did not seek to conquer territory. They did not fight for political gain or the spoils of war. They wanted David. This laser-focused obsession reveals the true stakes of the conflict. This was no longer a military dispute between rival nations. This was a spiritual reckoning, a settling of an ancient account that had been festering for generations. The lineage of the Rephaim had been wounded in its very soul, its divine right to rule shattered, and it now sought to cauterize that wound and restore its honor through the ritual sacrifice of the man who had humbled them. It is a spiritual law that the memory of spilled blood does not easily fade. It cries out from the ground. The name of Goliath, once a source of invincible pride and terror, now echoed through the high-walled streets and shadowy alleyways of Gath as a raw, weeping wound, a constant reminder of their shame. A new generation was being raised in that city, and its children were not just told the story of their fallen champion. They were fed a daily diet of undiluted hatred. They were taught to despise the name of David with a religious fervor. For the sons of the giants, this shame was their inheritance, a bitter and heavy legacy passed down from father to son. Their pain became their identity. Vengeance became their sacred defining mission. The hunt was on, and it would not end until the hunter, or the hunted, lay dead. The years had spun on, weaving a tapestry of both triumph and sorrow. David, the boy from the sheep fields, the giant slayer of Elah, was now a king etched by time. The fires of youth that had once burned so brightly in his eyes had softened to the steady, knowing glow of a seasoned monarch. He had conquered cities, unified the tribes of Israel, and brought the sacred Ark of the Covenant to its resting place in his new capital, Jerusalem. His kingdom flourished under the protective shadow of God's favor. He was the sweet psalmist, the anointed king, the man after God's own heart. But while Israel prospered, the memory of Goliath was not allowed to die in Gath. It was kept alive, nurtured like a sacred flame in the city's darkest heart. It smoldered in the training yards where young giants swung impossibly heavy weapons. It was invoked in the pagan temples as priests called upon their dark gods for retribution. The shame of Elah had become a festering wound on the city's soul, a debt of honor that could only be paid in blood, and it was a debt they intended to collect. The moment came during yet another brutal war with the Philistines, a conflict that had become the ceaseless grinding rhythm of David's reign. It was on a dusty, sun-blasted battlefield near the Philistine border that the shadow of vengeance finally materialized with a terrifying and unexpected force. His name was Ishbi-Benob, a name few in Israel would have known, but one that carried the full, crushing weight of Gath's hatred. He was not just another soldier in the Philistine line. His origin, Gath, and his lineage of the sons of the giant connected him directly to the fallen champion. He had not come for territory. He had not come for spoils. He had come for the king. The sacred text reveals his intent with chilling precision. And Ishbi-Benob, one of the descendants of Rapha, whose bronze spearhead weighed 300 shekels and who was armed with a new sword, said he would kill David. The language is stark and personal. This was no random encounter in the chaos of battle. Ishbi-Benob had prepared for this moment his entire life. He had trained, he had armed himself, he had positioned himself with a singular, all-consuming objective. His heart did not burn with the normal fire of war, but with the cold, clear flame of ancestral justice. He believed himself to be the chosen instrument of vengeance for his fallen brother, the rightful executioner of the man who had disgraced his house. David, now older, was on the field. It was his nature. He had always been there, leading his men, praying with them, inspiring them with his presence. But on this day, the battlefield was an unforgiving place for a king no longer in his prime. The years of ruling, of fighting, of carrying the weight of a nation had taken their toll. A weariness had settled deep into his bones. His reflexes, once as sharp as a striking serpent, were a fraction slower. His strength, once legendary, now had its limits, and Ishbi-Benob the hunter saw it. Through the dust and din of the clashing armies, the giant saw his opportunity. He saw the flicker of exhaustion in the king's eyes, the slight hesitation in his movements. With a guttural roar that was both a war cry and a declaration of vengeance, he charged. He moved with a speed that belied his immense size, his new sword a blur of deadly light. The weapon was a masterpiece of destruction, its weight, its balance, its razor-sharp edge all converging for one final fatal blow. For a terrifying moment, David, the anointed of God, found himself staring into the face of his own death. It was a brutal, direct, and silent confrontation. No other warrior in all his years of fighting had ever come so close to extinguishing the lamp of Israel. Ishbi-Benob raised his arm, the new sword glinting under the harsh sun, ready to bring it down and sever the thread of Israel's history. For a heartbeat, time seemed to freeze. The giant had the strength, he had the position, he had the perfect moment. The story of David was about to have a very different, very bloody ending. But what the giant did not know, what he could never have comprehended, was that David, even in his moment of physical weakness, was surrounded by a different kind of strength. He was protected by men who carried the same spirit of unwavering faith and loyalty that had guided him since his youth. From out of the chaos, a figure emerged. Abishai, son of Zeruiah, David's own nephew, and one of his most fiercely loyal commanders. The scriptures record the divine intervention with beautiful simplicity. But Abishai, son of Zeruiah, came to David's rescue. He struck the Philistine down and killed him. Abishai's appearance was no accident. He was the embodiment of the next generation rising to defend not just a man, but the divine purpose that God had established through him. He was the living continuation of the covenant, the outstretched arm of God in a moment of profound human frailty. Abishai's sword did not just save a king, it saved a kingdom, it saved a promise. The shock of this near-fatal encounter was so profound that it led to a dramatic and permanent decision. As the battle subsided, David's men surrounded their weary king. Their faces were grim, their eyes filled with a new protective fear. It was then that they made their own vow, recorded in 2 Samuel. Then David's men swore to him, "Never again will you go out with us to battle, that you may not quench the lamp of Israel." This declaration carries an immense spiritual weight. They no longer saw their king as just a warrior or a brilliant strategist. They saw him for what he truly was: the lamp, the living flame that illuminated their path as a nation, the physical presence of God's favor in the midst of the chaos of the world. The near death of David revealed a deeper truth. The war against the giants was no longer his individual mission. The time of the solitary shepherd hero was over. Now, the battle was a collective responsibility. The promise God had made to David needed to be guarded, protected, and sustained by other men willing to lay down their lives for something that transcended politics and military strategy. Ishbi-Benob had fallen, but his attempt had left a chilling trail. Gath had sent one of its best, and it had nearly succeeded. The vengeance was real, it was personal, and it was still in motion. Even with the heroic intervention of Abishai, the tension did not cease. An enemy does not retreat so easily when they believe they are fulfilling a sacred mission of blood. As David was led from the field, his mighty men remained on high alert, their hands tight on their sword hilts. They knew the threat had not been extinguished. The brothers of Goliath did not fight only with spears and swords. They fought with memory, with the burning pain of a name that had been ridiculed before the entire world. And they knew, with a certainty that chilled them to the bone, that another brother would soon rise to take his place. The death of Ishbi-Benob at the hand of Abishai was a momentary relief, a gasp of air in a war that seemed determined to drown Israel in blood and fear. But what had seemed like the climactic end of a vengeful threat was in reality only the first act in a rapid, brutal sequence of final confrontations. The physical lineage of Goliath, the last remnants of the Rephaim in Gath, was still breathing. 3 other giants, each bearing his own unique mark of strength and a shared legacy of hatred, still moved like vengeful specters along the borders of Philistia. They were the final dying embers of Gath's fury, and they were about to be extinguished, one by one. The next to emerge from the shadows was a warrior named Saph, also called Sippai. He was a being of imposing posture, whose name in the ancient tongue carried the ominous meaning of threshold or basin, perhaps hinting at his role as a gatekeeper of their dark heritage. Though the sacred text provides few details about his specific stature or weaponry, his name and his origin are enough. His mission was clear: to continue the legacy of fear that Goliath had so perfectly embodied. He represented the desperate final effort of the Rephaim to maintain their symbolic dominion over the imagination of Israel, the dominion of silent terror, of the hulking shadow that imposes its will without uttering a single word. In yet another of the ceaseless battles between the armies of Israel and the Philistines, Saph faced David's mighty men, and like Ishbi-Benob before him, he could not withstand the sword of those who fought under the covenant of God. The text does not name the specific warrior who brought him down, a significant detail in itself, but it records the ultimate fact with stark finality. Saph fell, another giant was slain. Another tendril of Gath's vengeance was severed. The war machine of Israel then moved to Gob, a place whose name means cistern or pit, a fitting location for the burial of an ancient evil. It was here, in a new battle, that the most direct reflection of Goliath made his stand. His name was Lami, and the Book of Chronicles identifies him with chilling clarity as the brother of Goliath the Gittite. His appearance on the battlefield was a shocking and impactful moment for the veterans of Israel. He carried a spear with a shaft, like a weaver's beam, a weapon crafted with the same brutal technology and inhuman scale as his infamous brothers. Lami was more than just a descendant. He was a living, breathing mirror of Goliath himself, a terrifying copy of strength, technique, and arrogance. He had perhaps been trained his entire life for this one moment, to be the one who would finally restore the family's honor. But he too would fall. The man who faced him was Elhanan, son of Jair. And Elhanan's name, which means God is gracious, proclaims the very foundation of the victory before the first blow was even struck. It was not the strength of Elhanan's arm or the sharpness of his sword that won the day, but the unmerited favor of the Lord. The man who killed the mirror of Goliath did not need to be remembered as an epic hero in his own right. His victory served as a testament that he was merely another willing instrument in the hands of a faithful God. It was the quiet, inexorable fulfillment of the promise made to David, that the lineage of the wicked would not prevail against the Lord's anointed. And then, finally, the most peculiar and perhaps most spiritually significant of the descendants appeared. He was a nameless warrior from Gath, described only by his great stature and a bizarre, unsettling physical deformity. As 2 Samuel records, he had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, 24 digits in total. This strange detail was not merely a physical curiosity, it was deeply symbolic. In the spiritual numerology of the Bible, the number 6 represents man. It is the number of imperfection, of human effort falling short of divine completeness. The number 7 represents divine perfection and rest. To have 6 fingers and 6 toes was to be marked, to carry in one's very body the brand of a corrupted, arrogant, and incomplete humanity, a humanity that constantly strives to achieve godhood on its own terms, but can never succeed. This final giant presented himself with pride, his deformity a mark of his unique power in his own eyes. He stepped forward and publicly defied Israel, his taunts a pathetic echo of the grand challenge issued by Goliath decades earlier. But like his infamous kinsman, he too would fall. The one who silenced him was Jonathan, the son of David's own brother Shimea. It was David's own blood, his own family, that served as the instrument to end this final chapter of the giants' war. It is as if God himself wanted to make it clear that the victory over this ancient, cursed lineage was not limited to the generation that began the conflict. The anointing and the promise extended through David's faithful descendants. 4 giants, 4 attempts at vengeance, 4 catastrophic defeats. The closing statement in 2 Samuel chapter 21, verse 22, serves as the final powerful epitaph for this entire saga. These 4 were born to the giant in Gath, and they fell by the hand of David and by the hand of his servants. There is something profoundly powerful in this concluding phrase. Though David himself did not personally wield the sword in these last 3 confrontations, the victories are still attributed to him. It was because of him, because of the anointing that rested upon him, and because of the purpose he carried, that these giants fell. They were not just fighting against individual men, they were fighting against the unshakable purpose of God. With these deaths, the visible, physical lineage of the Rephaim in Philistia dissolved into the dust of history. The direct heirs of Goliath's rage were defeated, one by one, each slain by a servant who carried the same spirit of faithfulness that had accompanied David since the day he first picked up 5 smooth stones. The age of giants was over. The land was at last physically free from their terror. But even in the relief of these victories, a subtle question began to echo in the minds of the most discerning. Why did the biblical writers record these battles with such meticulous precision? Why preserve the names, the weapons, the strange deformities? What was the deeper purpose behind this careful, detailed preservation of these seemingly secondary battles? The answer, perhaps, lay in the wars that were yet to be fought, the wars that were no longer of flesh and blood. The physical giants were dead, but their shadow remained, long and dark, over the future of humanity. When the last of Goliath's 4 brothers fell before the servants of David, the biblical narrative ceased its explicit mention of the giants from the lineage of Gath. The sword had done its work. The vengeance of a fallen house had been silenced. The land of Israel was, at last, physically free from the oppressive weight of that ancient, terrifying threat. A long and bloody chapter, it seemed, had finally come to a close, but a question, as vast and unsettling as the giants themselves, echoes through the silent corridors of Scripture. Did these giants truly disappear, or did they merely change their form? The Bible never treats the Rephaim and the Nephilim as mere genetic anomalies or historical curiosities. From the very beginning, in the book of Genesis, their presence is inextricably linked to a catastrophic spiritual collapse. After mentioning the giants, Genesis chapter 6, verse 5, delivers a devastating diagnosis of the human condition. And God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. The physical presence of these beings coincided with, and likely catalyzed, the complete moral and spiritual degradation of the human race, a generation that rejected holiness, truth, and justice with an aggressive and open hostility. Centuries later, as Jesus sat with his disciples on the Mount of Olives, speaking of the signs that would precede his return, he reached back to this dark, primordial era for his most chilling comparison. In the Gospel of Matthew, he declared, "As it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man." This was not a poetic metaphor, it was a direct prophetic warning. Jesus was telling us that the same spiritual patterns that defined the world before the flood, including the corrupting influence of fallen angelic powers, the explosion of unchecked violence, and the pervasive confusion between the sacred and the profane, would return with a vengeance in the last days. Therefore, the spirit that animated the giants was not buried with their colossal bodies. It survived. The lineage of the giants was always more than flesh. It was a spiritual operation. It was the physical manifestation of an ancient rebellion, an organized, age-old resistance against the divine order. The Rephaim fell physically, but the arrogant, defiant pattern they represented continued to manifest itself throughout human history. The pride that challenges God, the power that oppresses the righteous, the culture that exalts brute strength and self-sufficiency over faith, all of these are modern expressions of the ancient giants. In our own time, the giants no longer stalk the battlefields with bronze spears and impossibly heavy swords. They have become more subtle, more insidious. They now disguise themselves in the very structures of our world. They assume control of systems that are designed to erode faith, to distort truth, and to silently persecute the principles of the kingdom of God. They are the ideologies that mock the very notion of absolute truth. They are the technologies that promise connection, but deliver isolation and vanity. They are the cultural influences and entertainment that celebrate depravity and ridicule holiness with the same insolent sneer that Goliath once directed at the armies of the living God. These new giants may not have a visible 6 fingers, but their actions reveal a spiritual deformity that is far more profound. They may not stand over 9 feet tall, but the destructive impact they have on faith, on the family, and on the very fabric of truth far surpasses any physical measure. They are fueled by the exact same ancient spirit, a spirit of destruction, dominion, and utter contempt for the Most High. And in the face of this reality, an inevitable and urgent question imposes itself upon us. Are we prepared? In the days of David, it took one willing servant, one well-aimed stone, and an unshakable trust in God to bring down a giant. But today, are the servants of God not distracted? Have our stones of simple, potent faith not been forgotten, exchanged for the polished, ineffective pebbles of pragmatism and compromise? The spirit of the Rephaim remains active, but the guardians of the promise, the giant slayers of this generation, seem to have fallen silent. This is precisely why these forgotten stories of Goliath's brothers must be rediscovered. They are not just historical footnotes or memories of a distant past. They are spiritual maps for the present. They show us that the enemy does not simply vanish after a single defeat. He regroups, he rebrands, he transforms. They teach us that the most important spiritual battles are not always the most visible ones, and that the modern battlefield may be the human heart, the mind, and the culture itself. And they remind us that the same God who gave victory to the servants of David is still searching for men and women today who are willing to wield the sword of truth with courage and unwavering fidelity. The last giants are no longer found in the fields of Gath. They stand in the halls of power that shape our modern world. They are embedded in the narratives that mock the cross, in the structures that deny the authority of God, and on the digital altars we have built to the idols of power, vanity, and control. But the promise of God is as true today as it was in the valley of Elah. 1,000 may fall at your side, 10,000 at your right hand, but it will not come near you. The war continues, and though the names and faces of our giants have changed, the essence of the battle remains the same. The cursed lineage of the giants fell before the anointing and faithfulness of a few, and it will fall again before those who rise, not in their own name or their own strength, but in the mighty and unconquerable name of the Lord of hosts. The age of giants is not over. The time for giant slayers has come again.